It's not impossible to think of Putin hobbling into the dock in The Hague like some old Nazi.
Vladimir Putin's war against Ukraine has cost hundreds of thousands of lives of soldiers on both sides and of Ukrainian civilians. Under international law, the invasion of a UN member state which poses no imminent threat to the invader amounts to the crime of aggression. But can Putin be prosecuted? My next guest, Geoffrey Robertson, answers these questions and many more in a groundbreaking exercise in legal imagination. Geoffrey is with us this evening. Geoffrey, welcome to Times Radio. Good evening.
Good evening, Rosie.
So the idea, I really want to sort of grapple with this, is that you could put Putin on trial. I mean, you start your book by saying, is this not wishful thinking? And I have to say, on
No.
first contact with this, I thought maybe this is. Why not?
For two reasons. Firstly, although it's unlikely, he might end up like Milosevic. There might be a coup, his army may remove him. There are possibilities. So we saw one with Prigozhin and his march on Moscow got within 200 miles, and Putin came on with white face. His heavily Botoxed face went white, and he talked about treason. And of course, he summarily, extrajudicially, probably executed Prigozhin, but there may be more, and particularly in his high command, if Moscow does suffer seriously, then it's possible that he'll end up like Milosevic. You remember, everyone thought he was riding high, and his people in the end overthrew him, delivered him to The Hague, and to get rid of their sanctions. And so it's not impossible to think of Putin hobbling into the dock in The Hague like some old Nazi.
And if that was the case, who would be charging him, first of all, and what would they be charging him with?
Well, that's the big question, because his crime, clear crime, is that of aggression. He has invaded a member state without just reason, and the casualties, which will be up to 500,000, it's suggested by the end of this year, are down to him. He's responsible for the consequences of the war that he ordered. So the question of the obvious court to deal with him is the International Criminal Court. But there's a problem. They've got a crime of aggression. Mm-hmm. The crime of aggression means that you invade a peaceful state with a character, gravity, and scale that amounts to a manifest breach of the UN Charter. Well, that definition fits Putin like a glove. So why isn't the ICC able to prosecute him? Because it cannot prosecute leaders of states which are not members of the ICC.
And of course, Russia is not, yes.
Russia is not, nor is America, nor is China. So that means we have to have another court, an aggression tribunal of some sort, if international law is to be vindicated. And there are 39 countries, of which Britain is one, so is America, that are meeting. They call themselves the core group, and they're meeting to try to work out how to set up such a court. Ukraine is very much in favor, of course. That is in some ways driving the exercise, but they haven't got very far. They have to work out how to get over head of state immunities and amnesties. Putin is already
presumably if we're talking about a situation where the war is finished in some capacity between Russia and Ukraine, any kind of agreement, Putin might say amnesty has to be part of it.
That's right. I'm sure he will. And the only way around that is a court that's dealing with international law. It's got to be an international court because international courts, my court, Sierra Leone, struck down amnesties, and that has been generally followed, so that if you have an international court, it's not bound by local amnesties, it's not bound even by agreements for amnesty. So that's an essential way to go.
Historically,
There is
it is.
one other way.
Oh, please,
Sorry.
please say.
No, I was just going to say there is another way that, while it's not perhaps the best, and why Anglo-American lawyers are horrified by the suggestion, it's a trial in absentia, i.e. without Vladimir Putin in the dock, watching it no doubt on Zoom as it takes place. Now, before your viewers gasp at this, unbeknown in Britain, remember trials in absentia work perfectly well in almost every European country, in Ukraine, which is important, and we even had one in international law, the Tribunal of Lebanon. And so the United Nations Human Rights Committee, which sets the standards for fair trial, has said that trials in absentia may be fair, so long as anyone convicted can come back and reopen them. And I'm sure that would be the case with Mr. Putin in any tribunal that was set up. But there are problems, firstly, with the judges. Can you have judges from NATO countries? Well, there are very distinguished judges from South Africa and Malaysia and Brazil and Trinidad.
So you need to source non-NATO judges to try and, well,
that's
be the deciders.
And I think there are sufficient distinguished international judges from those countries. But the other thing which must be done if you're going to have a credible trial in absentia is to appoint lawyers to defend with all their might Vladimir Putin. And international courts do this with recalcitrant defendants. They appoint what are called amici, friends of the court, to take every point that's possible in their favor. So you'd have to have a dream team for Vladimir Putin. I'm sure Mr. Dershowitz would be happy to join it. I wouldn't recommend Rudy Giuliani, but there are...
And if Putin was found guilty, if he hadn't turned up, I mean, I think it would be highly unlikely. I guess we'd assume that he would do that unless he was forced in some kind of coup scenario. If he didn't turn up, it feels very unlikely that he would take any of this seriously. I mean, what would actually the practical repercussions be?
Well, he might not take it seriously, but others would. The great benefit of the judgment of Nuremberg was that it confounded Holocaust deniers ever since. There was the evidence. Now, a trial would, I'm sure, dismiss the kind of lies the Kremlin have been telling about the Nazis in control in Ukraine or the genocide they were carrying out. And it would destroy Putin's defense, which has been notified to the UN of self-defense. I'll come to that in a minute. But clearly, if the benefit of having an authoritative judgment is, firstly, there are a lot of countries that are not facing the fact that Russia is led by an international criminal on the same level of Stalin, Hitler, Genghis Khan. They were all guilty of aggression. And they're not acting sufficiently seriously about this case. And moreover, Putin is busy rewriting the school textbooks in Russia to claim that the invasion was justified. And smart school kids who can access the judgment on the internet will get the truth. So there are those assets. I think those advantages, as well as a way of vindicating international law.
Of
What
course.
other way do we have?
Well, I mean, the legal process you've laid out seems so complex. It requires an awful lot of international will and willing to put in place new structures, new processes. How do you think, or do you think Putin will ever, at some point, face some kind of consequence for his actions?
Well, we'd like to think so. Whether he will or not, whether he will hobble into that dock like some old Nazi having been overthrown uh, for advantages that Russia might get from the West, who knows? But at least his guilt will be authoritatively described. And you've got to remember that what he's claiming of self defense is what is called a preemptory self defense. That was the defense invented by the lawyers for George Bush when he invaded Iraq in 2003. And it's nonsense. It's a perversion of international law that suggests that a country can subjectively decide on its own paranoia that another country might attack it in the future and then attack that country. And that's just not on. I mean, with America, they said, oh, Saddam's got a bomb and he might use it against us, so we'll attack him. That was appalling. The British Attorney General, the Blair government, rejected it. Clearly, the Attorney General said it's not part of international law, and Britain went to war on a very different theory that an old resolution about Saddam when he invaded Kuwait had somehow miraculously revived and allowed Britain to go to war without the Security Council second resolution. Well, the Attorney General himself said that's at least arguable. But when a barrister says something is arguable, what he means is I'll take a fee with a grin on my face to argue it, but we're not going to win. So I think the advantages of an in absentia trial, if it's done fairly with distinguished independent judges, and if Putin is defended by first-rate counsel, will have an impact. It will do something to vindicate international law.
How much appetite is there to do it? Who would be in charge of saying, okay, if we want to put him on trial without him being present, this is the process we've got to do, and this is who's got to be involved?
Well, there are 39 countries involved at the moment in planning, and they're meeting. They're not giving themselves very much publicity because they think they haven't worked out quite how to do it. But the will is certainly there. There is a feeling, even certainly America feels that it should be that he should be accountable for what is plainly the worst. Nuremberg judgment called it the supreme crime because from the invasion, the decision to invade, all the other crimes come. So there is the will, and the work has started. Where it will end up, they're not, of course, America and Britain are not in favor of trials in absentia. And I wrote my book partly to explain why they should be.
And it is a genuinely brilliant read on all the sort of legal architecture and the impact that it could have. Geoffrey Robertson, thank you so much. The author of The Trial of Vladimir Putin, and the idea that he could be put on trial even if the president did not turn up.